Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to answer that question, what settings do I use for wildlife photography? But before we get into that, if you're new here, I'm Adrian, I take photos of wildlife, and normally on this channel, I don't talk much about settings, gear, or Lightroom hacks because I don't want you to be a better setting setter and gear buyer and Lightroom hacker. I want you to be a more skilled wildlife photographer. But in this episode, we'll make an exception and we'll talk a bit about settings because you gotta know your settings and you gotta know how to set your settings if you're gonna be a wildlife photographer. So if that is something for you, please like and subscribe. What settings do I use for wildlife photography? I see this question being asked constantly. And I think that other creators are giving really frustrating answers to this. So I'm gonna tell you what I wish somebody would have told me when I was sitting there wondering what settings do I use for wildlife photography. So when I was asking myself this question, I really just wanted rules of thumb because it felt like I had these three settings: ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop or aperture. And I didn't know where to begin. If somebody had just told me to prioritize my shit, I would have known where to begin, and everything would have been so much easier. Okay, so if you were the kind of person that is asking, what settings do I use? Number one, know your settings, know what they do. Number two, all you're gonna do is prioritize your settings from most important to least important to you, to your taste. I prioritize first by aperture or f-stop, same thing basically, then shutter speed, then ISO. My aperture, that gives me, us photographers, the most creative freedom because we get to decide how much of the foreground and background is blurred, whether we're just sharply focused on the eyes and everything else is blurry, or whether the entire subject is in focus and only the background and foreground are blurred, or if absolutely everything in the entire shot is super crispy focused. So that is why my aperture f-stop is always my number one priority. I decide what I want my shot to look like, and then I just dial in whatever number I need to achieve that look. I'm gonna go over rules of thumb to achieve looks right after this. So then number two, my second priority is my shutter speed. I want my animals to almost always be absolutely frozen in action. I don't want any motion blur at all. So if I am shooting a moving animal, I will almost always shoot at 1250 shutter speed. That's pretty fast. It's not gonna let in a lot of light, but that's what I have to shoot at if I want to freeze the action. Sometimes if an animal isn't moving very fast, I can get away with going down to just 1000, and I will try it in the moment. I do a lot of like small adjustments and trying things out in the field, but in general, I know just go ahead and start at 1250 shutter speed so I can achieve the look I want. The least of my concerns is my ISO. So I bring my ISO up and down to whatever the hell it's gotta be to achieve the proper exposure or exposure that's good enough, because I personally will just fix my exposure in Lightroom to avoid too much film grain. But again, personally, I don't really give a shit if there's grain in my shot. There's a lot of people who really prioritize having zero grain or as little grain as possible in their shots, but I'm not one of them. When you prioritize what you want your shot to look like, and then you prioritize the settings to get it there, you're not left thinking, what settings do I put in? You just know I have to put in these specific settings to get the shot the way I want. So, rules of thumb, like I said earlier, moving animals, lions chasing wildebeest, birds in flight, anything that's kind of fast moving, I will use the 1250 shutter speed. If it's slower moving, I will go down to 1000. And those are the settings I need for my camera and specifically my lens, my big telephoto lens, because of the way it is. If I'm shooting something that's totally still, I can also go all the way down to only 800. Okay, then Aperture. Don't you love when you forget what you ordered from Uber Eats and then you get the package and you're like, oh my god, it's so exciting, I don't know what's in here. Oh my god, there's shrimp shumai! Who could have known? It's so exciting! Rules of thumb for Aperture in wildlife photography. So personally, I will use a aperture somewhere between 4 and 5.5 for smaller animals like squirrels and little birds and stuff like that. That's because I want my foreground and background to be out of focus. I want my subject to be totally in focus. Now, if those animals are very close to me, I do have to go all the way down to 4 or lower if I can do that on the particular lens I am shooting on. When it comes to larger animals, I will be somewhere in the range of 6 to 8. Again, that's going to help get the foreground and background out of focus, but make sure the entire animal is in focus. So I'm talking things as big as dogs, lions, hyenas, wildebeest, stuff like that. I'm going to be somewhere in that range. And then if you want everything to be in focus, you want the animal and its environment around it to be in focus, I would go up to 12. I do this with very large animals that I want to show as part of a landscape, usually stuff like elephants or giraffes or rhinos, and I still want all of that background scenery and foreground scenery to be in focus. And then ISO. So I just go ahead and have auto ISO. Now I do set it into brackets, meaning that my ISO will not go below wherever I say or above wherever I say. So it's going to be different for each camera, but that is an option you have. My rule of thumb is always to have it as only as high as it needs to be and no higher. Again, I'm just not concerned about noise grain. If you are concerned, or if you want to achieve images with almost zero grain in them, you're gonna have to stay between 100 and 200. You might be able to push it to 300 depending on your camera and like the sensor size, stuff like that. But beyond that, you're gonna start seeing noise. Now, in my opinion, images really start to look shitty when you get to the 3000s. They're a rough ride in the 3000s. I go there sometimes. Usually when I have a really noisy image where I had to go over 3000 or up to 3000, I will turn that photo black and white and it gives it kind of a cool, noisy, old black and white feel. So there's a helpful tip if you end up taking a shot where you feel like the film grain is kind of overwhelming, but you had to do it to get your shot relatively exposed. Also remember that you can let your ISO be a little lower than it technically should be and let your image be a little underexposed because you can bring it up in Lightroom. Some people don't like to do it. Personally, I don't care. I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I will talk to you the next time I get around to making a video.